At 3:12 local time, deep inside Russian-occupied territory, a single Ukrainian drone started its silent flight. No one knew it was coming. Not the soldiers on the ground, not the radar operators scanning the horizon, not even the electronic eyes Russia had spent millions to deploy. But in the next 90 minutes, everything would change. Russia, despite all its defenses, would be completely helpless. The drone, a compact Lu-TX variant, launched from a hidden airstrip near Zaporizhia. Its mission was simple in theory, but nearly impossible in execution. Get past layers of radar, acoustic sensors, and anti-aircraft defenses to reach a high-value target deep behind enemy lines. For Russia, the moment the drone left Ukrainian soil triggered silent alarms across multiple command centers. Satellites and surveillance systems noted a small blip of activity, a shadow moving faster than expected over frozen farmland. By 3:18, the Lu-TX had reached a corridor known to intelligence as the dead zone, a stretch where radar coverage dipped due to terrain, masking, rivers, and industrial complexes. At 90 kilometers per hour, the drone would cross this zone in 28 minutes. 28 minutes where it could be invisible to Russian eyes, a ghost moving across the snow. Its composite airframe was engineered for stealth. Radar signals scattered in random directions, never returning a clear echo. Even at close range, it appeared as nothing more than a faint glimmer, easy to dismiss as interference. But invisibility on radar didn't mean invisibility in the physical world. Sound carried, and Russia had spent decades trying to capture every whisper of movement in this sector. Microphones, acoustic arrays, and vibration sensors were deployed across villages, hills, and bridges. They could detect helicopters, trucks, even the faintest hum of a generator. For the Lu-TX, that was a risk. Its turbojet engine was small but loud. At 100 meters, it produced 82 decibels, a sound that could carry across quiet winter fields. The drone descended to 45 meters above the snow-dusted land, hugging terrain to avoid line-of-sight detection. Ahead lay 120 kilometers of open countryside before it could reach the first checkpoint. During this time, Russian operators saw nothing on their radar, their monitors filled only with static and the usual interference. Their sensors detected movement elsewhere, trucks, patrols, birds, but nothing approaching the speed or size of the Lu-TX. This was not luck, it was design. Every flight parameter, every throttle adjustment, every turn was pre-programmed to exploit known weaknesses in Russian coverage. The drone didn't react to threats because it didn't need to. The threats simply didn't exist in its path. At 3:32, the drone crossed a small village near the Dnieper River. Its heat signature was faint, almost indistinguishable from a small tractor in a plowed field. A Russian acoustic sensor detected a spike in the 4,000 to 8,000 hertz range, subtle like a distant wind chime, but the system dismissed it as an animal or environmental noise. The algorithms flagged it, but confidence remained low. No missile batteries turned, no jets scrambled. Russia's defenses had been designed for large aircraft, not a small, fast, purpose-built drone flying 45 meters above the ground. At this point, the Lu-TX had already crossed 3 defense sectors, each with overlapping coverage that should have guaranteed detection. Instead, it moved like a phantom, leaving a trail invisible to every system meant to stop it. The drone's onboard systems calculated terrain, masking continuously. Every rise and dip in the land, every tree line and building was a chance to remain unseen. The autopilot made minute adjustments, descending a meter here, banking slightly there, maintaining both speed and stealth. Even when crossing frozen rivers, where reflections could betray its presence to infrared cameras, the Lu-TX adjusted throttle and pitch to minimize heat signature. Its engine exhaust was spread across multiple ducts, cooling the output to blend with the surrounding air temperature. Russian satellites overhead saw nothing but faint thermal anomalies, dismissed as normal environmental variation. At 3:50, 38 minutes into the flight, the drone reached the edge of the first heavily defended industrial zone. This area was Russia's answer to low-altitude threats, automated missile turrets, radar arrays, and acoustic fusion sensors. The plan required timing, precision, and a touch of luck. The Loot-TX descended further, to 30 meters, weaving through the shadows of warehouses, power lines, and silos. Each movement had to consider multiple factors: speed, elevation, angle relative to sensors, and thermal profile. If it miscalculated, it would trigger alarms that could result in immediate interception. The operator on the Ukrainian side monitored every metric: heart rates, thermal readings, wind gusts, and remaining fuel were all critical. One small error could end the mission. The acoustic network, theoretically capable of triangulating any moving object in the zone, failed to register the drone accurately. Its algorithms were tuned for larger engine signatures and predictable flight paths. The Loot-TX moved too fast, too small, too low, exploiting every blind spot in coverage. When signals did return, they were misclassified as routine industrial machinery or passing vehicles. Russian operators debated whether a minor spike in readings justified firing a missile. Minutes passed, and no action was taken. The drone was inside the zone, invisible and untouchable, an object moving with perfect knowledge of the enemy's blind spots. By 4:05, the drone was halfway through the industrial sector, approaching its first primary objective, a command post coordinating electronic warfare. Russian defenses here were sophisticated. Missiles could track multiple targets simultaneously. Acoustic arrays and infrared cameras monitored every inch of airspace. Yet, as the Loot-TX approached, it remained unseen. Its autopilot calculated a climb to avoid a low-lying crane while maintaining speed. Engines throttled to reduce infrared signature. The system was operating flawlessly, executing maneuvers that would seem impossible in real time. From the ground, all that could be observed was the wind moving across smokestacks and the faint sound of a distant motor, barely audible against the hum of the facility. At 4:15, 63 minutes after launch, the Loot-TX crossed the perimeter. Any misstep now would be fatal. Missile batteries could reach it if it exposed itself, acoustic sensors could detect it if it slowed, and infrared cameras could spot it if the sun angle changed. But everything was calculated. The drone's flight computer anticipated environmental changes, adjusting every second. By the time it reached 4:18, the first Russian radar array that could have tracked it was already reporting no contacts detected. Operators squinted at screens, searching for anomalies. The drone was there, but it was also nowhere, moving with complete invisibility across defenses meant to guarantee its destruction. By 4:22, the Loot-TX had reached the inner zone of the target area, a sprawling complex of hangars, radar domes, and communications hubs. From the outside, it looked like any other industrial site, but Ukrainian intelligence had mapped every detail, down to the placement of generators, trucks, and even the orientation of solar panels. This was the moment where seconds mattered more than minutes. The drone descended to 20 meters, skimming above frozen fields that reflected infrared poorly, allowing it to blend seamlessly with the environment. Its autopilot executed subtle S-turns, compensating for minor gusts of wind, adjusting pitch to ensure that even if a camera briefly caught the heat signature, it would appear indistinguishable from a passing vehicle. Meanwhile, Russian operators continued scanning. Acoustic sensors had detected a faint hum, but algorithms dismissed it, unsure whether it was mechanical equipment or wildlife. The Loot-TX moved like a ghost, exploiting gaps that engineers on the ground hadn't even considered. At this range, radar would have been lethal if the drone was higher, but the low altitude kept it under the effective horizon. Russia's short-range missiles, the Tor M2 and Panzer batteries, were trained on standard aircraft profiles. The Lu-TX didn't match any known pattern. It was too low, too small, and moving too fast to be classified as a threat. By 4:28, the drone had navigated through a network of warehouses, avoiding tall cranes and storage tanks that could have triggered collision warnings. It passed beneath high-voltage lines, each one a potential radar reflection, yet its composite airframe absorbed and deflected signals, leaving nothing meaningful on enemy monitors. Inside, the onboard flight computer continuously cross-referenced satellite imagery with preloaded maps, adjusting course dynamically to avoid both visual and electronic detection. Every second counted. One wrong move could result in interception. Fuel was finite, battery power for navigation critical, but the drone maintained an almost supernatural composure. At 4:34, the first engagement layer appeared, a Tor M2 battery positioned on a ridge, radar spinning methodically, scanning the horizon. The battery commander had already noticed unusual activity on acoustic networks, readings showing minor irregularities, but nothing conclusive. Even as 3 sensors triangulated the sound, the data placed the drone outside the engagement envelope, too low for radar acquisition. The operator could have fired a missile, but the system demanded target confirmation. Minutes passed. The Lu-TX continued its approach, silent except for the faint whistle of the turbojet, masked by terrain. By 4:38, the drone reached the secondary objective, a radar communications hub, the brain coordinating all electronic traffic in the sector. Normally, any aerial intrusion would trigger an immediate defensive response. Cameras would lock, missiles would be cued, and the skies would light up with smoke trails. Not this time. The Lu-TX remained invisible. Its thermal signature blended with the surrounding buildings and machinery. Its radar footprint was negligible. Even the advanced AI of Russian automated systems failed to classify it as a threat. At this point, the drone's flight plan called for a controlled hover above a decoy truck. A GPS correction nudged it laterally by 3 meters to avoid detection shadows from the vehicle's exhaust. Microseconds mattered. The onboard processor calculated wind drift, engine heat, angle of approach, and adjusted trajectory to remain below radar detection thresholds. At 4:42, the drone released a small electronic disruptor over the hub. It was not an attack, but a signal, a pulse designed to momentarily confuse radar and sensor fusion systems, masking the next movement. Russian operators saw flickers, anomalies in their screens, but nothing definitive. They assumed routine fluctuations or system noise. The Lu-TX exploited the brief window, executing a lateral maneuver that moved it behind storage containers, completely out of line of sight. By 4:46, the drone had cleared the complex perimeter, approaching the final target, a high-value electronic intelligence station. Here, the stakes escalated. The target housed expensive receivers, mission computers, and intercept arrays, all capable of detecting incoming missiles and drones. At 4:49, the Lu-TX executed a calculated climb, just enough to gain line of sight for targeting, but still low enough to evade missile radar. Onboard cameras captured the target in perfect frame, processing images in real time, feeding them into the classification AI. The system had been trained on hundreds of images, learning the exact shape, angles, and shadows of the station. Within seconds, the AI identified the target with 96% confidence. Every calculation was critical. Distance, angle, altitude, speed, and potential obstacles were factored into the strike. At 4:52, the onboard navigation adjusted course to account for a previously unmapped generator and vent stack, recalculating descent angles to ensure precise targeting. Russian operators were beginning to notice anomalies. The acoustic network had now triangulated multiple sound sources, but the data remained inconsistent. The drone had moved again, exploiting terrain masking and environmental factors, effectively making itself invisible despite active detection attempts. By 4:55, it had positioned itself above the station, targeting the main antenna array. The Lu-TX released a precision warhead designed not for maximum destruction, but surgical strikes, eliminating only the critical components while leaving surrounding structures intact. The explosive was shaped, fragmenting in a focused cone, striking the heart of the target in milliseconds. From the ground, observers might have noticed only a faint flash, a minor disruption in a system that seconds earlier had been fully operational. By 5 o'clock, the strike was complete. The high-value electronics were destroyed, mission computers offline, receivers and signal processors rendered useless. Russia's defenses, trained for conventional threats, were helpless. They had everything in place to prevent an attack like this: radar, acoustic arrays, missiles, but the Lu-TX had slipped through every layer, executing a mission that seemed impossible. There was no dramatic explosion, no theatrical destruction, only a sudden, quiet incapacitation of a critical node. By 5:03, the drone turned for home, slipping back through the dead zone, retracing its invisible path, completely undetected. For over 80 minutes, it had been a ghost. For Russia, this was a failure that would require months to analyze. Every sensor, every defense system, every missile battery had been bypassed with precision, leaving operators staring at blank monitors, helpless. Ukraine had just pulled off a mission that rewrote the rules of engagement, proving that speed, stealth, intelligence, and meticulous planning could render even the most sophisticated defenses impotent. By 5:06, the Lu-TX was already 12 kilometers from the strike zone, flying low and fast, its mission computer shifting from attack logic to survival routing. The warhead was gone, but that didn't make it safe. In fact, it made it more vulnerable. Russian systems that had failed to stop the strike were now fully awake. Radar operators who had seen only static minutes ago were rechecking logs. Acoustic networks that had hesitated were now reprocessing buffered audio, hunting for patterns they had missed. Something had hit a protected facility, and that meant something had slipped through. The assumption was simple: if it came in, it might still be leaving. At 5:09, a Panzer S-1 battery 28 kilometers south received an emergency alert: unknown aerial object suspected, low altitude, possible drone. The system's search radar tilted downward, scanning closer to the horizon than doctrine normally allowed. Ground clutter filled the display: trees, buildings, power lines, but now operators were told to ignore the noise and look for movement within it. The Lu-TX, flying at just 35 meters, crossed a narrow river valley at that exact moment. To radar, it appeared for less than 2 seconds as a faint, shifting return, barely stronger than background interference. The operator hesitated. The track didn't behave like an aircraft. It flickered, then vanished behind terrain. Classification uncertain, engagement denied. 2 seconds later, the opportunity was gone. The drone had already dropped back below the ridgeline, using the Earth itself as a shield. At 5:13, Russian command linked acoustic data with thermal satellite sweeps, attempting to create a composite track. Algorithms drew a probable path northwest, but uncertainty remained over 3 kilometers. That was too wide for confident missile engagement. Still, they tried. At 5:16, a Tor M2 battery fired a single 9 M338 missile at a predicted intercept point. The missile climbed, arced, then dove toward where the drone should have been. But prediction is not detection. The Lu-TX had altered speed by just 12 kilometers per hour to compensate for a crosswind over open farmland. That small adjustment shifted its position by nearly 400 meters. The missile detonated in empty air, scattering fragments into a frozen field. Russian operators watched the telemetry fade, realizing they had fired at a ghost again. Fuel calculations inside the Lu-TX showed 22 minutes remaining, enough to reach friendly airspace if nothing forced a detour. but Russian air defense aircraft were now airborne. At 5:19, a pair of Me-28 helicopters lifted from a forward base, equipped with thermal imagers tuned specifically for low-flying drones. Unlike ground radar, they could look downward without terrain interference. This changed the geometry completely. The Lu-TX's autopilot recognized the threat from preloaded response logic. It descended further, now just 22 meters above ground, where even helicopter sensors would struggle against surface heat clutter. The drone threaded between tree lines, barns, and power pylons, each obstacle a potential collision hazard, but also a shield. At 5:24, one helicopter crew reported a possible thermal contact, small, fast, low. They banked to pursue, but the Lu-TX crossed into a patchwork of industrial exhaust vents and warm rooftops. On infrared, the area became chaos. The drone vanished into the thermal noise. The helicopter crew circled, scanning, but fuel and time were limited for them too. Meanwhile, the drone's engine temperature management system reduced exhaust heat by altering fuel mix, sacrificing a bit of speed for survivability. At 5:31, it entered the dead zone again, the same radar gap it had used on the way in. Russian defenses were alert now, but physics hadn't changed. Radar still couldn't see below the curvature and terrain masking. Acoustic sensors tried to reacquire, but wind had picked up, carrying farm machinery noise and distant traffic across the microphones. Signal confidence dropped. By 5:38, the Lu-TX was 9 kilometers from the front line. One last risk remained: electronic warfare. Russian jammers activated, attempting to disrupt GPS and command links. The drone switched to inertial navigation, flying purely on internal sensors and preloaded terrain maps. Accuracy decreased slightly, but not enough to matter. At 5:44, it crossed back over Ukrainian-held territory. No explosion marked its return. No dramatic moment, just a small drone descending toward a hidden recovery strip as dawn lightened the horizon. Behind it, Russian commanders were left with damaged infrastructure, confused sensor logs, and a single hard truth: their layered defenses had been present, active, and coordinated, and still completely helpless. By 5:50, the Lu-TX had landed in a concealed strip behind a ridge, its mission complete. Systems powered down quietly, leaving no trace for aerial or satellite observation. Ukrainian operators exhaled collectively, knowing what had just been accomplished. A drone had slipped past multiple layers of the most advanced Russian defenses, struck a critical intelligence node, and returned unscathed. On the Russian side, chaos began to ripple outward. Analysts pored over logs, trying to reconstruct what had happened, but the data was fragmented and contradictory. Radar screens showed gaps that shouldn't exist. Acoustic arrays recorded sounds that didn't match any known aircraft. Missiles had been launched and detonated harmlessly in empty fields. Troops were stationed at all the right points, yet the target had been neutralized without detection. It was a defeat engineered not by brute force, but by precision, planning, and understanding the vulnerabilities of the enemy. Commanders demanded explanations, firing questions across units, but answers were scarce. Satellites confirmed no incoming large-scale attack. Electronic warfare units scanned for emissions. Nothing. For months, Russian analysts would be left with a single uncomfortable truth: Ukraine had found a way inside their defenses, exploited every blind spot, and left no evidence of conventional infiltration. In Kyiv, however, the operation was already being debriefed, studied for replication. Every maneuver of the drone, every millisecond of its flight, every calculation of its autopilot was logged, analyzed, and stored. Lessons learned would inform future strikes. The successful strike demonstrated the power of combining stealth, low-altitude navigation, AI classification, and terrain masking into a single package. One small, silent drone had done what an entire fleet of aircraft and missile batteries could not. bypass, and neutralize high-value targets without alerting the enemy until it was too late. The psychological impact was immediate. Reports leaked to Russian units that defenses had been penetrated, that ghost drones were operating inside occupied territory, that nothing could be seen, heard, or intercepted reliably. Morale faltered. Command structures questioned whether standard procedures were sufficient. At the tactical level, soldiers in the field felt exposed. The ground beneath them was no longer reliably secure. And strategically, Ukrainian forces had proven that ingenuity and precision could level the playing field against overwhelming material advantages. The Luty-X itself would be reused, adapted, and improved. Minor tweaks to flight software, slight modifications to engines, and adjustments to targeting algorithms would ensure that future operations remained even more unpredictable. Meanwhile, Russian defense doctrine was forced into a painful reconsideration. Low-altitude, high-precision drones could no longer be ignored. Acoustic signatures and radar blind spots would need re-evaluation, and electronic warfare measures would have to adapt to counter unpredictable flight paths. But adaptation takes time, and Ukraine had gained a window, a fleeting opportunity to exploit these vulnerabilities repeatedly. By 6:15, Ukrainian operators were already planning the next phase. Satellite imagery from earlier that morning was reviewed again, looking for additional targets with similar layouts, radar shadows, and acoustic masking potential. Every calculation made previously was cross-referenced to expand operational reach. It was clear this was not a one-off strike. It was the opening chapter of a new approach to asymmetric warfare. Across the Black Sea and surrounding territories, Russian units would be left questioning every system, every protocol, and every assumption about what constituted a threat. For them, this was more than just a tactical loss. It was proof that the enemy could strike unseen, exploit weaknesses no one thought mattered, and emerge without a single casualty or traceable footprint. By the time the sun rose fully, the Luty-X was stored, recharged, and ready for its next mission. Ukrainian command celebrated silently, knowing the impact went far beyond the destroyed electronics. The operation had proven a concept. With intelligence, precision, and patience, even the most fortified defenses could be rendered helpless. Russia's failures were not just mechanical or procedural. They were systemic, born of overconfidence in layered defenses and underestimation of an adaptive opponent. Ukraine had just pulled off a strike that would echo in military analyses for years, demonstrating that technology alone does not win wars, but the understanding and creative application of it can turn the tables in a single, decisive moment. In the quiet aftermath, there was no fanfare, no explosions, no dramatics, just the sound of data being reviewed, algorithms running, and a small drone resting quietly, having rewritten the rules of engagement.